Imagine waking up before dawn, pulling on your leather flight jacket, knowing that statistically you might not come home. Not because of a rumor, not because of a gut feeling, but because the math, cold, brutal, unforgiving math, said that if you flew enough missions over Nazi Germany in 1943, your chances of surviving were less than 1 in 4. Now imagine being told that today's mission is the deepest penetration into enemy territory ever attempted by American bombers. No faíta de escort, no protection, just you, your crew, your aircraft, and 600 miles of German sky filled with the deadliest air defense system the world had ever seen. This is not a story about victory. This is a story about courage walking straight into catastrophe. This is the story of October 14th, 1943. This is Black Thursday. The year is 1943, and the Second World War is grinding forward with a ferocity that the world had never witnessed before. On the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers are locked in a death struggle across frozen steppe and burning cities. In the Pacific, American and Japanese forces are trading punches across thousands of miles of ocean. In North Africa, and now Italy, Allied armies are pushing northward through blood and sand. But high above all of it, a new kind of war is being fought. A war of altitude and airspeed. A war of oxygen masks and bomb sites. A war where young men from Ohio and Texas and Pennsylvania climbed into aluminum tubes and flew into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The United States Army Air Forces believed in a theory. It was called precision daylight strategic bombing, and it was built on a simple but intoxicating premise. If you could destroy the key industrial nodes of the German war machine, the ball-bearing plants, the oil refineries, the aircraft factories, you could cripple Germany's ability to fight without having to invade. You could win the war from the air. The aircraft that would carry this theory into reality was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. And the name was not accidental. The B-17 was bristling with machine guns. 1350 caliber weapons arranged in turrets and waist positions and nose stations. The idea was that a tight formation of B-17s could create an overlapping field of defensive fire so intense that enemy fighters would be torn apart before they could get close enough to cause serious damage. Flying in what was called a combat box formation, dozens of bombers flying in a precise three-dimensional arrangement, the B-17s would protect each other through sheer volume of defensive gunfire. It was an elegant theory. It was also, as the men of the 8th Air Force would discover, dangerously incomplete. The 8th Air Force had arrived in Britain in 1942, fresh, optimistic, and untested. Their British allies, who had been fighting this war since 1939, looked at the American plan for daylight precision bombing with a mixture of admiration and deep concern. The Royal Air Force had tried daylight bombing early in the war and had been slaughtered. They had switched to nighttime area bombing, accepting that precision was impossible in the dark, but that survival was at least more plausible. RAF Bomber Command Chief Arthur Harris, the man they called Bomber Harris, had tried to convince the Americans to join the British approach. The Americans politely declined. They believed in their bombers. They believed in their gunners. They believed in the Flying Fortress. The first missions over occupied Europe seemed to validate American confidence. Early raids against targets in France and the Low Countries went relatively well. German fighter opposition was fierce but manageable. Losses were painful but not catastrophic. The 8th Air Force began pushing deeper, striking targets inside Germany itself. And that is where the theory began to crack. Inside Germany, beyond the range of Allied fighter escorts, the Luftwaffe waited. And the Luftwaffe of 1943 was not a spent force. Despite everything the war had cost Germany, despite the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, The German fighter pilots defending the Reich were among the most experienced, most skilled, and most deadly aviators in the world. Men like Egon Mayer and Hans-Joachim Marseille. Men who had been flying and fighting since the Battle of Britain, since the skies over Malta and the Mediterranean. Men who had developed new tactics specifically designed to defeat the defensive fire of the B-17 formations. Head-on attacks, diving attacks from 12 o'clock high, coordinated assaults that came in waves, pressing the American gunners to their absolute limits and beyond. The summer and early autumn of 1943 had already given the 8th Air Force brutal lessons in what deep penetration raids cost. The first Schweinfurt mission on August 17th, the same day as the Regensburg raid, had cost 60 bombers in a single day. 600 men. Gone. Just like that. The Ploesti oil refineries raid in August had been a catastrophe. Mission after mission was coming back with terrible losses, and the strategic planners in Washington and at 8th Air Force headquarters were beginning to face an uncomfortable question. Was the theory wrong? Was the self-defending bomber formation a myth? But the theory had powerful advocates, and the targets were real. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, in particular, had become something of an obsession. Ball bearings, those small, precision-engineered steel spheres that allowed metal to rotate against metal with minimal friction, were essential to virtually every piece of machinery in the German military. Tanks, aircraft engines, submarines, artillery pieces, trucks, all of them required ball bearings to function. And the factories around the city of Schweinfurt in Bavaria produced an estimated 40 to 50% of all ball bearings used by the German military. If you could knock out Schweinfurt, the logic went you could freeze German industry in place. Tanks would stop moving. Aircraft engines would cease. The entire military machine would grind to a halt. This logic was compelling enough that after the costly August raid on Schweinfurt, which had damaged the factories but not destroyed them, the planners began preparing a second strike. They would go back. They would finish the job. And this time, they would coordinate the attack with a simultaneous raid on Regensburg, where a major Messerschmitt aircraft factory was located to split the German fighter response. This time, they would end the ball-bearing question once and for all. The mission was designated Mission 115. The date was originally planned for October 8th, but weather intervened again and again, pushing the mission back day after day as weather systems rolled across Europe. The crews who had been briefed knew what was coming. They knew the target. They knew the risks. And they waited day after nervous day, wondering if today would be the day, living in that particular psychological hell that combat soldiers know well. The waiting that is almost worse than the fighting itself. Finally, on the evening of October 13th, the word came down. Tomorrow, October 14th, the mission was on. At airfields across East Anglia, at Grafton Underwood, at Thilly, at Molesworth, at Bassingbourn, at a dozen other bases scattered across the flat English countryside. Young American airmen received their briefings and tried to sleep. Most did not sleep well. Some wrote letters home. Some played cards. Some simply lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling of their Nissen huts, listening to the wind, thinking about what morning would bring. At Schweinfurt, in Germany, the citizens of the city were asleep. The ball-bearing workers were asleep. And the German radar operators and fighter controllers who would soon be tracking hundreds of American bombers making their way toward the heart of the Reich. They were waiting, too, with the patient confidence of defenders who knew their territory, who knew their aircraft, and who had every reason to believe that today, like so many other days, the Americans who came to bomb Germany would pay a terrible price. Before dawn on October 14th, 1943, a kind of controlled chaos began spreading across the American air bases of East Anglia. Ground crews who had been working through the night were finishing their preparations. Mechanics crawled over B-17s in the darkness, checking engines, checking fuel lines, loading ammunition belts that stretched for hundreds of feet, checking and rechecking everything that could be checked. Armorers winched 500-pound bombs up into the bellies of the aircraft, each bomb carefully fused, carefully positioned in the bomb racks. The aircrews made their way to briefing rooms that smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee and anxiety. When the curtain was pulled back to reveal the mission map, with the red yarn line stretching deep into Germany all the way to Schweinfurt, there were audible reactions. Some men swore quietly. Some went completely silent. Some shifted in their seats and looked at the faces of the men around them, their crewmates, the men they had trained with, the men they would fly with into whatever was waiting over Germany. The intelligence officers went through the briefing, the route, the timing, the escort plan, the expected weather, the expected fighter opposition. The word expected was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that briefing room, because what was expected and what actually waited over Germany were going to turn out to be very different things. The escort plan called for P-47 Thunderbolt fighters to accompany the bombers for the first leg of the journey, as far as Aachen, on the German border, where the Thunderbolts would reach the limit of their fuel range and have to turn back. Beyond Aachen, the bombers would be on their own for approximately 90 minutes of flying through German airspace. 90 minutes. It sounds almost manageable when you say it that way. 90 minutes of unescorted flight. But at the speeds and altitudes involved over the distance to Schweinfurt and back, those 90 minutes represented a journey through the most heavily defended stretch of airspace in the world, with no protection except the guns of the formation itself and the courage of the men behind those guns. The aircraft began starting their engines in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound of Wright's Cyclone radial engines coughing to life, one after another, filled the cold English air. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer who also served as top turret gunner, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. 10 men in an aircraft that was, when all was said and done, a tube of aluminum and plexiglass flying through air that at 25,000 feet was 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. 10 men breathing through oxygen masks, encased in leather and fleece and electric heated suits, watching their instruments and watching the sky around them and watching the faces of the men they were responsible for keeping alive. The formation of bombers, 291 B-17s in total assigned to the Schweinfurt mission, began taking off from their respective bases in the gray English morning and began the slow, fuel-consuming process of assembling into their combat formations over England before setting course for the continent. Assembly itself was a dangerous business, with hundreds of aircraft maneuvering in crowded airspace, sometimes in clouds, with pilots focused on not colliding with the aircraft around them, while also managing their own aircraft, their fuel burn, and their position in the forming stream. As the formations crossed the English Channel and began making their way over occupied Belgium and the Netherlands, they picked up their P-47 escort. For a time, the mission proceeded according to plan. The P-47s flew alongside and above the bomber stream, their presence a comfort even if their range was limited. German fighters were seen in the distance, but stayed largely at bay while the Thunderbolts were present. Then came Aachen, the German border, and the P-47s waggled their wings and turned for home, their fuel tanks exhausted, their pilots watching the bombers disappear eastward into Germany with something that must have been, if we're being honest, a certain amount of guilt mixed with relief. They had done what they could. They would go back to England and refuel and wait for the bombers to return. If they returned, the moment the P-47s turned away, the Luftwaffe unleashed itself. What followed was not simply a battle. It was a systematic assault designed and executed with terrifying professionalism. German fighter controllers had been tracking the bomber stream since it crossed the coast, feeding information to fighters across a wide area of Germany and occupied territory. Jagdgeschwader units, fighter wings, had been vectored into position. The pilots were briefed on the bomber stream's size, its altitude, its course. They knew what was coming. They were ready. The German fighters attacked in coordinated waves. Some came from 12 o'clock, head-on, diving through the bomber formation at closing speeds of more than 500 miles per hour, giving the American gunners fractions of a second to track and fire. Others came from above and behind, or from below. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, the cream of the Luftwaffe's day fighter force, hammered the formations again and again. Some German pilots flew so close that American gunners could see their faces. But the Luftwaffe had more than just fighters waiting. German anti-aircraft batteries along the route opened fire as the bombers crossed over defended areas, filling the sky with bursting black smoke from exploding shells, what the airmen called flak, from the German word Flugabwehrkanone. Flak could not be outmaneuvered, could not be shot at, could not be intimidated. It simply erupted around the aircraft in random, deadly patterns, and all a pilot could do was maintain formation and fly through it and hope. Inside the B-17s, the combat was intimate and horrific in equal measure. Gunners in cramped positions tracked targets that appeared and disappeared in seconds. The ball turret gunner, crammed into a plexiglass sphere hanging beneath the belly of the aircraft, rotated his turret and fired at fighters diving for below. Waist gunners on both sides of the aircraft fired through open windows at temperatures far below zero, their hands and faces at constant risk of frostbite. The tail gunner, isolated at the rear of the aircraft, watched fighters forming up behind the formation and called out warnings and fired until his guns were empty or until something stopped him. Aircraft began to fall. Not gently, not gracefully. B-17s that were hit by cannon fire or by fighters that pressed close enough to do real damage began shedding pieces. Engine cowlings, sections of wing, chunks of fuselage. Some caught fire immediately, the aviation fuel igniting in sheets of orange flame that were visible from miles away. Some went into spins, their control surfaces shot away, the pilots fighting controls that no longer responded. Some simply disappeared in explosions when a cannon shell or incendiary hit a fuel tank or the bomb load. In each falling aircraft were 10 men. Some managed to get out. Parachutes were seen opening, white canopies blooming against the gray German sky. Each one a man who was alive, but who would spend the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. Some parachutes open on fire. Some men came out of aircraft that were already too low or spinning too fast for parachutes to do any good. Some men were already dead before their aircraft hit the ground. The surviving bombers pressed on toward Schweinfurt. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about Black Thursday, that despite the carnage, despite the losses that every crew could see around them, despite the knowledge that the fighters would be waiting on the way home too, the formations maintained their discipline. Men who had watched their friends' aircraft go down in flames, who had seen parachutes burning, who had crew members slumped over their guns or lying wounded on the floor of the aircraft, continued to fly the mission. They flew their bomb runs. They dropped their bombs on Schweinfurt. The bombing was, by the standards of 1943 precision bombing, reasonably successful. The ball-bearing factories were hit. Production was disrupted. Damage was significant. But it was not the crushing, war-ending blow that the planners had hoped for. And the cost of delivering even this incomplete blow was staggering. The return flight was as brutal as the approach. The Luftwaffe did not let the bombers go. German fighters that had landed and refueled continued attacking the formations on the way back. More aircraft fell. More men died or were taken prisoner or floated down on parachutes into German fields and villages, where they were met by civilians, by soldiers, by the whole complex and sometimes dangerous reality of being an enemy aviator in the country you had just bombed. When the surviving aircraft finally crossed back over the Dutch coast, and the German fighters pulled away, and when the exhausted remnant of the P-47 escort appeared to shepherd the bombers back to England, the true scale of the disaster began to become apparent. Aircraft that had held together through the mission were landing with dead crew members aboard, with wounded men who had been tended by crewmates throughout hours of combat, with aircraft so riddled with holes and damaged systems that it was almost miraculous they had flown at all. At bases across East Anglia, ground crews and intelligence officers and medical personnel waited, and counted the aircraft as they came back, and kept counting and kept waiting, and finally reached the terrible moment when it was clear that no more aircraft were coming. The empty hard stands, the concrete pads where aircraft had been parked before the mission, were eloquent in their emptiness. 60 B-17 flying fortresses had been shot down over Germany and occupied territory. 60 complete aircraft gone. 600 men, crew members, were dead, captured, or missing. An additional 17 aircraft had been so badly damaged they were written off as total losses. Another 121 aircraft had suffered damage of varying severity. In terms of aircraft and crew losses in a single mission, it was the worst day the United States Army Air Forces had ever experienced. It would remain one of the worst days in the entire history of American air power. The mathematics were merciless. The 8th Air Force had sent 291 aircraft. It had lost 60 plus 17 written off. That was a loss rate of more than 26%, more than 1 in 4 aircraft destroyed outright, before counting the damaged ones. For the crews aboard those aircraft, the losses were even more personal and more devastating. Of the roughly 3,000 men who had flown the mission, more than 600 would not return to England that day. At airfields across East Anglia, the accounting took place in silence and in anguish. Squadron commanders marked up their records. Intelligence officers took statements from survivors. Medics treated the wounded. Chaplains began the work that chaplains do after catastrophes. In mess halls and quarters, and on the hard stands where aircraft had not returned, men sat with their grief and their fear and their exhaustion and tried to make sense of what had happened. The loss rate made the continuation of deep penetration, unescorted daylight bombing mathematically impossible. If the 8th Air Force continued at this rate, it would destroy itself in a matter of weeks. The strategic bombing campaign, the theory of precision daylight bombing that had been the foundation of American air strategy, was facing its most serious crisis. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, understood immediately what Black Thursday meant. So did General Hap Arnold in Washington, commanding the entire Army Air Forces. So did the planners and strategists who had built the theory of strategic bombing. The unescorted bomber could not fight its way through to its target and back with acceptable losses. The self-defending bomber formation, the flying fortress concept that had seemed so convincing in theory and on the early missions, had been broken by the Luftwaffe's determined and professional defense of the Reich. Deep penetration raids were suspended. The 8th Air Force would not fly another major unescorted mission deep into Germany for months. The strategic bombing campaign went into a kind of enforced pause while the debate raged over what had gone wrong and what needed to change. And the answer, when it came, was not complicated. The bombers needed fighters, long-range fighters that could accompany them all the way to the target and all the way back. This had been known before Black Thursday. It was not a new insight. The problem was that no such fighter existed. The P-47 Thunderbolt, excellent aircraft that it was, simply could not carry enough fuel to make the round trip to deep targets inside Germany. The P-38 Lightning had range, but had problems operating effectively in the cold conditions of high-altitude combat, over Europe. The solution, when it arrived, would transform the air war completely. The North American P-51 Mustang, fitted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was already in production, but had not yet arrived in significant numbers in England. When it did arrive, equipped with drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty to reduce drag, the P-51 had the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And in the hands of American fighter pilots directed by new tactics, including the crucial decision to release the fighters to pursue and destroy Luftwaffe fighters rather than staying glued to the bombers, the P-51 would begin systematically destroying the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilot force. But that was in the future. On October 14, 1943, the future was not visible. What was visible was the empty sky over East Anglia where 60 B-17s should have been landing, and the empty chairs in mess halls, and the gear and clothing and personal effects of men who had not come home. The men who had survived Black Thursday carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Not all of them were able to talk about it easily. The generation that fought the Second World War was often reticent about the worst of what it had experienced. Not from shame, but from something more complex. Some things are hard to translate from experience into language, particularly for men of that generation and that culture who had been taught that endurance was more honorable than expression. But over the years, in interviews and memoirs and the work of historians, the voices of the men who flew Black Thursday came through clearly. Men like the crews of the 306 Bomb Group, flying from Philly. Men like the navigators who threaded courses through the maze of German defenses. Men like the gunners who fired hundreds of rounds at fighters pressing their attacks home from point-blank range. Men who were awarded distinguished flying crosses and air medals and silver stars for actions that most of the watching world never knew about, in a sky that most of the watching world never thought about. There were extraordinary individual stories. Pilots who maintained control of their aircraft with hydraulic systems shot out and control surfaces damaged, nursing crippled bombers hundreds of miles back to England, or, if England was too far, to the emergency landing strips along the English coast. Navigators who plotted return courses by dead reckoning when their navigation equipment had been destroyed by battle damage, guiding their aircraft home by mathematics and memory and instinct. Bombardiers who completed their bomb runs through intense anti-aircraft fire, focused on the Norden bomb site while everything around them was chaos and violence. Gunners who kept firing when they were wounded, who field-dressed their own wounds and kept fighting, who helped wounded crewmates while also doing their own jobs. There was the crew of the B-17 that lost 2 engines over Germany and fell behind a formation, a death sentence, because the straggler without the protective firepower of the group around it became the primary target for every German fighter in the area. And yet some of these stragglers made it back, shot to pieces, navigating on 2 or even 1 engine, sometimes at altitudes where there were easy targets. Some of these aircraft made it back to England through a combination of skill and determination and the kind of luck that is impossible to predict or explain. There were acts of heroism that were never reported because the men who witnessed them did not survive, and the men who performed them were too modest or too traumatized to describe what they had done. The full human story of Black Thursday will never be completely known because too many of the men who lived it are no longer here to tell it, and because some of what happened on that day could not be put into words even by those who experienced it. The German perspective on Black Thursday was, understandably, one of triumph. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots had done exactly what they had been tasked with doing, defend the Reich against the American bombers with maximum effectiveness. The German pilots who participated in the defense of the Reich on October 14, 1943, many of whom were among the most decorated aviators in the Luftwaffe, had proven that the self-defending bomber formation could indeed be broken, Given sufficient numbers of capable fighters, intelligent tactics, and the inherent advantage of defending familiar territory against attackers who had to fight their way in and fight their way back out. But the German victory on Black Thursday was, in retrospect, the high water mark of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend against the American strategic bombing campaign. Within months, the P-51 Mustang would arrive in force, and the entire dynamic of the air war would shift. The Luftwaffe would find itself fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with vast industrial resources, an enemy that could replace aircraft and train pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. The German fighter pilot force, which had entered Black Thursday as a seasoned, experienced, elite force, would be ground down over the following months and years of the air war until experience levels dropped dangerously and the Reich could no longer put enough capable defenders in the sky to stop the bombers. But on October 14, 1943, none of that future was visible. The Luftwaffe had won decisively, and in the aftermath of Black Thursday, the strategic implications were significant enough that even American planners who had been the strongest advocates for the daylight precision bombing theory had to confront hard truths. The theory itself was not entirely wrong. Ball bearings really were a critical bottleneck in German production. The Schweinfurt factories really were important. The concept of attacking industrial choke points to undermine an enemy's war-making capacity was strategically sound. What was wrong? What Black Thursday proved catastrophically was the delivery mechanism. The unescorted bomber could not survive in contested airspace defended by a modern, professional fighter force. The Flying Fortress was not, in fact, a fortress. It was a remarkably capable aircraft crewed by remarkably brave men. But it was not a self-contained weapons system capable of fighting its way through Germany without support. This lesson, painful as it was actually absorbed fairly quickly by the 8th Air Force and by American air power doctrine. The suspension of deep penetration raids was followed by intensive work to bring long-range escort fighters into service. Operational testing of the P-51 with auxiliary fuel tanks accelerated. By early 1944, the Mustangs were coming, and the air war over Europe was about to enter a new and final phase. The second Schweinfurt raid, despite its terrible cost, also prompted significant German responses that had their own strategic implications. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, recognized the vulnerability that Schweinfurt represented and immediately began working to disperse ball bearing production, scattering it to multiple smaller facilities that would be harder to target and destroy in a single strike. This dispersal actually reduced German vulnerability to the kind of concentrated strike that the Americans had been attempting, which means that even if the bombing campaign had continued without the catastrophic losses of Black Thursday, the window of maximum vulnerability may have been closing anyway. This irony is one of many that color the history of the strategic bombing campaign. War rarely delivers simple lessons, clean victories, or clear cause and effect chains. Black Thursday was a tactical defeat for the Americans and a tactical victory for the Germans. But its strategic consequences were more complex than a simple win or lose framing suggests. For the men who flew the mission, the strategic complexity was largely irrelevant. They had done what they were ordered to do. They had flown to Schweinfurt. They had bombed the target. They had fought their way in and fought their way back. Those who survived had done so through skill and courage and luck in roughly equal measure. Those who did not survive had died in the service of a cause that they believed in, even if the execution of that cause on that particular October day had cost far more than it should have. The 8th Air Force would go on. Despite Black Thursday, despite the losses that threatened to make the strategic bombing campaign unsustainable, the 8th Air Force would rebuild, re-equip, incorporate the lessons of the October disasters, and emerge in 1944 as a more powerful and more effective instrument of air power than it had been in 1943. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang as an escort fighter would change everything. The decision to use fighter escorts aggressively, to send the Mustangs out to hunt and destroy Luftwaffe fighters rather than passively protecting the bombers, would eventually break the back of the German fighter defense. But the men who died on Black Thursday did not know any of that would happen. They flew and they fought, and they died in the service of a strategy whose full meaning and ultimate outcome they could not see. They were doing their jobs. They were flying their missions. They were trusting in their training and their aircraft and their crewmates, and many of them, in something beyond all of that, in the cause that had brought them across the ocean to fly in someone else's sky against someone else's defenses. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, for all the lives they cost, were never completely destroyed by bombing. German dispersal and repair efforts, combined with the acquisition of ball bearings from neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland, meant that the expected collapse of German production never fully materialized. This is one of the most debated questions in the history of strategic bombing: whether the campaign, with all its human cost, achieved results proportionate to the price paid. The debate continues among historians. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war found that the overall campaign had significantly damaged German industrial production and had imposed enormous costs on the German war economy in terms of resources diverted to air defense, fighter production, anti-aircraft artillery, and the repair of bomb damage. But the debate over specific targets and specific missions, over whether Schweinfurt was worth what it cost, over whether the theory of attacking industrial choke points worked as its advocates promised. These questions do not have simple answers. What has no ambiguity at all is the courage. The men who climbed into their B-17s on October 14, 1943, who flew into the most heavily defended airspace in the world without fighter protection, who maintained their formations under attack from hundreds of enemy fighters while anti-aircraft shells burst around them, who pressed onto their target and dropped their bombs and fought their way home. Those men were doing something that required a quality of courage that is difficult to fully appreciate from the safe distance of history. The nature of courage in combat is complex. It is rarely the simple, clean heroism of popular imagination. It is more often a matter of continuing to do what you were trained to do, continuing to perform your function, continuing to be present for the crewmates who depend on you, even when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to do something, anything other than what you're doing. The ball turret gunner who keeps firing his guns when he can see aircraft on fire all around him is not experiencing an absence of fear. He is experiencing fear and doing his job anyway. That is what courage actually looks like. The young men of the 8th Air Force, and they were young, many of them barely out of their teens, most of them in their early 20s, virtually all of them under 30, had been civilians barely 2 or 3 years before October 14, 1943. They had been high school students and factory workers and farmers and college students. They had been drafted or they had enlisted, had gone through training, had crossed the Atlantic on troop ships or in aircraft, had arrived in the green English countryside and been assigned to their groups and their squadrons and their crews, and had begun the process of learning what combat actually was, as opposed to what training had told them it would be. By October 1943, the veterans among them had learned. They had seen friends killed. They had come back from missions with aircraft full of holes, with wounded crewmates, with the particular exhaustion that comes not just from physical effort, but from sustained terror and concentrated violence. They knew what they were facing when they were briefed for the October 14th mission. They went anyway, and the new men, the replacement crews who had just arrived, who were flying their first or second or fifth missions, who still had the freshness of training on them, they went too. Because that is what you do. Because the formation needs to be full. Because the target needs to be hit. Because 10 men in a B B-17 are not just 10 individuals, but a system, an organism, a small community of interdependence in which everyone's survival depends on everyone else doing their job. In the decades since the war, the veterans of the 8th Air Force have gathered for reunions. They have visited memorials. They have walked through the museums that preserve the aircraft they flew, touching the aluminum skin of preserved B-17s with hands that knew those aircraft in a different way. The way you know a machine that has saved your life. The way you know a space that you occupied in extremity. They have talked to students and historians and documentary filmmakers, trying to bridge the gap between their experience and a world that had never known anything like it. Most of them, when asked what they wanted people to understand about what they did, said something simple. Remember the ones who didn't come home. Remember that they were young men with whole lives ahead of them. Remember that they made a choice, or perhaps were given no choice because the times made the choice for them, and that the choice cost them everything. Remember them not as abstractions or statistics, not as numbers in a loss table, 60 aircraft, 600 men, but as people, as the specific, irreplaceable individuals they were. The B-17 numbered 42 to 30,813, call sign Dry Martini, piloted by Captain Gordon Ramsay of the 384th Bomb Group, made it back. The crew had fought through the entire mission, had taken damage, had lost their ability to maintain formation at one point, and had been attacked by fighters pressing their advantage, but had fought back and had made it across the channel and had landed in England with an aircraft full of holes and crew members who were shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion and relief. That was one story. The B-17 of Lieutenant Robert Sheeks of the 91st Bomb Group was last seen going down over Germany after engine fires that could not be controlled. The crew may have bailed out. The records are incomplete. Sheeks himself did not survive. That was another story. And there were hundreds more stories like both of those, ranging across every point on the spectrum between survival and loss. 60 years after the war, in the archives of the Library of Congress and the National Archives and museums and libraries across the United States and Britain and Germany, the documents of Black Thursday are preserved. Mission reports, casualty lists, after-action reports, individual crew records, letters written home before the mission and letters written home after by those who survived, intelligence assessments, bomb damage surveys, German records of the air battle, Luftwaffe combat reports by German fighter pilots who attacked the formations. All of these documents, read together, tell a story that is simultaneously a story about a specific event on a specific day and a story about something much larger. They tell a story about the limits of theory when it meets reality, about the cost of learning through experience rather than anticipating correctly, about the extraordinary human capacity for courage under conditions that should make courage impossible, about the way that military organizations, democratic nations, respond to defeat, not by giving up, but by changing, adapting, correcting, and returning. The United States Army Air Forces did return. The strategic bombing campaign continued, transformed by the lessons of Black Thursday and equipped with the long-range escort fighters that made deep penetration raids possible without catastrophic loss rates. The bombing of Germany escalated through 1944 into a campaign of enormous scale and devastation, eventually reducing much of German industry and many German cities to rubble. The contribution of strategic bombing to the Allied victory in Europe remains debated, but the Luftwaffe was destroyed as a meaningful fighting force, and German production, while remarkably resilient throughout the war, was significantly disrupted. And Schweinfurt itself was bombed repeatedly by both the Americans and the British through the remainder of the war. The city suffered tremendously. The ball-bearing factories were damaged, repaired, dispersed, damaged again. The workers who ran those factories lived through years of bombing with all the terror and loss that entailed. War is not clean. War does not respect the categories we use to contain it. The workers of Schweinfurt were, in the moral calculus of the Second World War, legitimate targets because of what they produced and what those products enabled. But they were also people living their lives in a city that had become a target, in a country whose government had started a war that consumed everything in its path, including, eventually, itself. The legacy of Black Thursday reaches forward to the present day in multiple ways. The strategic bombing debate, the question of whether air power alone can win a war, whether attacking industrial and infrastructure targets can force an enemy to its knees without ground invasion, has been revisited in every major conflict since the Second World War. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each of these conflicts has reinvited the arguments that Schweinfurt raised about precision bombing and collateral damage and the relationship between air power and war termination. The answers have been, depending on the conflict and the circumstances, mixed. The escort fighter requirement, the lesson that long-range bombers need fighter protection to survive in contested airspace against modern air defenses, has been incorporated into every subsequent air campaign doctrine. No American air campaign since the Second World War has attempted to operate large numbers of manned aircraft in contested airspace without suppression of enemy air defenses and fighter escort. The lesson of Black Thursday has been learned and is embedded in doctrine and in the design of aircraft systems and in the training of aircrew. The men who serve in the 8th Air Force and lived are now very old, and the last of them are passing. The men who flew Black Thursday and did not come home are now simply names on memorials and entries in archives. But the story of what they did, the courage with which they flew into a situation that they knew was desperately dangerous, the professionalism with which they completed their mission despite catastrophic losses, the resilience with which the survivors returned to flying after what they had experienced. This story belongs to history in a way that transcends any particular debate about strategy or doctrine or effectiveness. October 14th, 1943 was the worst day in the history of American strategic bombing. It was the day the theory of the unescorted, self-defending bomber met reality and was broken. It was the day that 600 young American men paid with their freedom or their lives for a lesson that the theorists and the planners should perhaps have anticipated. And it was the day that the survivors of the 8th Air Force demonstrated something about human endurance that continues, 80 years later, to command respect and admiration and a kind of awe. Black Thursday did not end the strategic bombing campaign. It changed it. It forced a reckoning with what was possible and what was not, and it drove changes that ultimately made the campaign more effective and less costly. The men who died on October 14th, 1943, did not die for nothing, but they also died for a mistake, for an overconfidence in theory that the brutal reality of combat corrected at terrible cost. That combination, dying for a cause while also dying for a mistake, is one of the most morally complex things that war produces. It resists simple narrative. It cannot be resolved into a clean story of heroism rewarded or sacrifice vindicated. It simply is what it is. 60 aircraft, 600 men, one October day, and all the complicated truth that lies within those numbers. The flying fortresses that came home on October 14th, 1943 landed with torn metal and dead engines and blood on the floors of their bays. The men who climbed out of them were changed in ways that do not entirely translate into language. They had been through something together in the sky over Germany that bound them to each other and to the memory of those who had not come back in ways that would last for the rest of their lives. They went back to their bases. They ate. They slept, some of them, though the sleep of men who had been through what they had been through is not always restful. They were debriefed by intelligence officers who asked them what they had seen and what they had done, and they answered as best they could. And then, in the days and weeks that followed, most of them climbed back into their aircraft and flew again. Because the war was not over. Because there were more missions. Because that is what you do when you are a soldier. You continue. The sky over Schweinfurt on October 14th, 1943 was full of aircraft and fire and the sound of engines and guns and the sight of parachutes opening and aircraft falling. Today it is quiet. The city has been rebuilt. The ball-bearing factories, or what remains of them, are part of a changed industrial landscape. The people who walk the streets of Schweinfurt today live in a peaceful, democratic Germany, part of a unified Europe, allied with the descendants of the young Americans who once flew over their city with bombs in their base. The world that existed on October 14th, 1943, is gone. The world that replaced it, built in part on the sacrifice of the men who flew Black Thursday, is what we have. Remember them. Remember the 60 aircraft. Remember the 600 men. Remember what courage looks like when theory meets reality and the only option is to press on. Remember Black Thursday. Now let me ask you this, and think about it carefully. If you had been a young American airman in 1943, knowing exactly what the odds were, knowing what had happened on previous raids, knowing that your fighter escort would turn back before you reached the most dangerous part of the journey, would you have climbed into that aircraft? And what does your answer tell you about the men who did? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the men who fought the air war over Europe, share it with someone who loves history. Hit that subscribe button because we have many more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories of courage, strategy, sacrifice, and the moments when history turned on the decisions and actions of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Leave a comment below telling me what aspect of this mission you found most remarkable. Your thoughts matter, and this community grows stronger when we talk to each other about the history that shaped our world.